you were told, a lie. For years, the world believed Japan had discovered a formula strong enough to defy economic gravity. A formula so perfect that prosperity appeared guaranteed, insulated from the cycles that shaped every other nation. And the salaryman stood at the center of that illusion, carrying the quiet certainty that loyalty, endurance, and obedience would always return security. But when I look back at the long winter that followed the bubble's collapse, it becomes clear how fragile that illusion truly was. Before the fall, Japan radiated confidence. Land prices climbed toward impossible heights. Credit expanded as if risk itself had vanished. Newspapers celebrated the rise of Japan #1, and corporate leaders behaved as though the future had already been conquered. In that moment, the country believed it had escaped the limits that constrained the rest of the world. Economists later called this phenomenon the wealth illusion. It was not uniquely Japanese. The United States had its own version during the 1980s credit boom. Western Europe followed similar patterns. But in Japan, the illusion intertwined deeply with national identity. Then the bubble burst. The unraveling did not explode overnight. It crept. It hollowed out confidence slowly, silently, until households and corporations realized the ground beneath them had shifted. Asset prices collapsed. Banks sank under mountains of bad debt. The economy slipped into deflation. And the salaryman, once the embodiment of national strength, found himself unprotected in the face of forces no institution could control. This documentary exists for a single purpose: to reveal how Japan's longest stagnation reshaped the meaning of wealth and why the lessons forged in that era matter for anyone living through uncertainty today. The story of Japan's long stagnation begins with a system that once appeared infallible. The salaryman model emerged from the ashes of war, built on lifetime employment, seniority-based wages, and a shared belief in corporate destiny. It was more than a labor structure. It was a social contract. Companies offered stability. Workers offered loyalty. Promotions followed age more than competition. Households could plan decades ahead because incomes rose predictably with time. But beneath its orderly surface, the model required conditions that were not permanent: a young population feeding into the labor force, steady long-term growth, expanding exports, rising productivity. When Japan advanced through the 1970s and 1980s, these conditions held. The system performed with remarkable precision. Yet even before the bubble collapsed, cracks formed quietly. Competition intensified across East Asia. Technology accelerated. Global markets demanded flexibility that the traditional structure resisted. And as the population began to age, the financial weight of seniority-based wages grew heavier. When the bubble burst in the early 1990s, the foundations gave way. Corporate profits collapsed. Companies could not honor every guarantee they had once made. They responded by shifting toward a non-regular workforce, expanding temporary contracts and outsourcing. The labor market split into two worlds, one still protected and one exposed. Younger workers entering during the late 1990s became the early members of what would later be called the lost generation. Their careers began not with promise, but with limitation. The unraveling of the salaryman model did not just alter employment structures. It changed the architecture of financial security itself. The assumption that wealth could be built through a single employer no longer survived the reality of prolonged stagnation. As the 1990s progressed, a deeper transformation unfolded. Wage stagnation, the silent erosion of prosperity, began reshaping Japanese households. Real wages stopped rising. Promotions that once followed predictable timelines slowed, then froze. Bonuses shrank. The upward slope that had defined middle-class life flattened into a long plateau. This stagnation did not announce itself with sudden shock. It moved quietly, year after year, as paychecks remained unchanged, while expectations continued to rely on the past. Families that had planned their futures on the assumption of rising income found themselves confronting a new and uncomfortable reality. The idea that each year would be better than the last faded. Consumption weakened. Households reconsidered discretionary spending. Travel declined. Retail softened. Even essential purchases were approached with caution. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. As consumption stalled, companies reduced investment. As investment slowed, wages remained stagnant. Deflation deepened the cycle further, pushing households into increasingly defensive behavior. Japan was not alone in this pattern. Germany experienced similar stagnation in some regions after reunification. In the United States during the Great Moderation, productivity rose while wage growth fell behind. Yet in Japan, the stagnation endured longer, scarred deeper, and reshaped expectations more profoundly. Behind each static paycheck lay a systemic truth. Japan had entered an era where income could no longer be trusted to grow. Economists later described this condition as wage-dependent wealth vulnerability, a condition in which households rely heavily on income that no longer expands. The salaryman, who once embodied upward mobility, now confronted a world where mobility had slowed to a crawl. The promise that loyalty would lead to material improvement no longer aligned with the economic landscape. For the first time since the post-war reconstruction, the future began to feel smaller than the past. Savings had long been the quiet backbone of Japanese households. Decades of post-war hardship had etched a deep instinct to preserve, to store, to protect. By the time the lost decades began, Japan remained one of the world's highest saving societies. Even as wages stagnated, the cultural memory of frugality remained strong. Families continued to save out of caution, discipline, and habit. But the economic environment had changed. Interest rates drifted towards zero. Bank deposits offered safety but no growth. The very foundation of the Japanese saving ethos, cash as security, began to weaken. In a deflationary environment, the nominal stability of savings disguised a deeper erosion. Households realized that money stored today would not grow to meet the needs of tomorrow. The promise of stability through saving began to fade, replaced by the uneasy awareness that standing still meant falling behind. This slow erosion forced a quiet reconsideration. If cash could no longer protect the future, what could? A gradual shift emerged. Some households began exploring financial instruments, long considered risky. Equities, mutual funds, long-horizon investment accounts. It was not a sudden transformation. Risk aversion remained deeply rooted. Memories of the bubble's collapse lingered. Market volatility still haunted public sentiment, but the direction was unmistakable. Step by step, diversification entered the vocabulary of financial survival. In the 2010s, a significant turning point arrived with the creation of NISA, a tax-advantaged program designed to encourage participation in the financial markets. Younger generations, facing uncertain wage growth and doubts about pension sustainability, adopted the system more readily than their parents. Their financial reality demanded it. Saving alone was no longer enough. Stability now required strategy. Preservation required participation. The concept of wealth preservation expanded from a passive habit to an active discipline. Corporate pension reforms reinforced this shift. As companies reduced their defined benefit commitments, the responsibility for retirement security moved steadily toward the individual. Public pension systems, strained by demographic imbalance, added further uncertainty. Households faced a new reality. Financial survival required taking responsibility for risks once shared by employers and the state. This transition represented more than a financial adjustment. It reflected a slow cultural evolution. A society that once defined safety through consistency began redefining safety through adaptability. The tools that built security during decades of rapid growth could not function the same way in an age of stagnation. But if financial behavior changed slowly, demographic pressure transformed the nation more quickly. Japan's population, once its source of economic vitality, began to age at a pace unmatched by any other advanced economy. Birth rates fell, life expectancy rose. Year after year, the balance between workers and retirees shifted further. Pension systems felt the pressure first. Structures designed during eras of expansion could not sustain the obligations of a shrinking workforce. The guarantee of long-term retirement security grew uncertain. Public debate intensified. Economists warned of structural imbalance. Younger generations questioned whether the system would survive long enough to support them. The weight spread across the welfare system. Healthcare expenses increased. Social security outlays grew. To stabilize these commitments, taxes and mandatory contributions slowly increased. For households already constrained by wage stagnation, these additional burdens tightened financial limits even further. Disposable income shrank, long-term planning became increasingly fragile. Japan was not alone in confronting these pressures. Nations across Northern Europe faced similar demographic trends. Public discussions of a pension crisis became unavoidable as populations aged, but Japan's challenge unfolded with greater intensity. Its demographic shift was sharper, faster, and more deeply entwined with its economic trajectory. Economists describe this new reality as intergenerational reallocation, a rebalancing of responsibility across age groups. Younger workers bore heavier financial burdens. Their capacity to build wealth eroded under rising taxes, stagnant wages, and uncertain future benefits. For the salaryman, this demographic transformation revealed a deeper truth. Stability was no longer guaranteed by corporate loyalty or national systems. The foundations of security had fundamentally changed. The social consequences reached far beyond economics. Japan's long stagnation reshaped the rhythms of life itself. Marriage rates declined. Many postponed starting families, uncertain whether they could support children in an era of shrinking opportunity. The decline of lifetime employment weakened the cultural authority of the salaryman model. Younger generations no longer believed that the sacrifices demanded by traditional corporate life would be rewarded. Sociological research showed a growing skepticism toward corporate structures that no longer protected workers as they once had. New generational identities emerged from this environment. One was the Satori generation, a cohort marked by modest expectations, frugality, and a preference for emotional stability over material ambition. Their values were shaped by the economic environment they inherited. Another phenomenon gained visibility: the hikikomori economy. Individuals who withdrew from employment, and sometimes from social life entirely, represented an extreme response to stagnation, pressure, and a narrowing sense of possibility. Work-life balance gained importance. Flexibility became desirable. Autonomy carried more meaning than hierarchical advancement. Freelance roles, contract work, and alternative career paths expanded. The meaning of success evolved. Instead of pursuing the status symbols of earlier decades, many prioritized personal well-being, independence, and sustainable equilibrium. In a society shaped by stagnation, identity shifted from ambition to adaptation. The lessons drawn from Japan's lost decades extend far beyond its borders. They speak not only to one nation's economic journey, but to the fragility of wealth in any society, shaped by cycles of growth, stagnation, and demographic change. Over time, these lessons formed a clear message for anyone whose financial life depends on systems that once appeared unshakable. The first lesson is simple yet uncomfortable. Wage-based wealth is fragile. When income growth slows, households lose the foundation on which long-term plans are built. Japan Salarymen experienced this firsthand. The belief that rising wages would carry a family from early adulthood to retirement proved vulnerable to macroeconomic forces that no individual could control. Across the world, nations have discovered similar truths during periods of financial stress. The collapse of wage momentum in Southern Europe after the 2008 crisis and the income volatility observed in the United States after 2020 reflect the same underlying risk. When a society anchors its financial hopes to wage progression, stagnation strikes at its core. The second lesson is equally critical. Dependence on a single institution is a systemic risk. Japan's corporate culture relied on mutual loyalty. Workers trusted companies to protect them. Companies trusted workers to remain committed. But as profits shrank and demographic pressures intensified, the system could no longer sustain every promise it had made. Lifetime employment weakened. Pension obligations strained corporate balance sheets. And for workers, the realization emerged that stability built on a single employer was far more fragile than they imagined. The vulnerability of this model has been echoed across other regions. In several Western economies, the decline of defined benefit pensions has forced individuals to bear risks once carried by corporations. The lesson is clear. In a world shaped by uncertainty, security cannot rest on a single source. Diversification is not only a financial principle, it is a survival strategy. A third lesson emerged from Japan's demographic transformation. Age structure can rewrite a nation's economic destiny. When the balance between youth and age shifts too far, pension systems strain, tax burdens rise, and economic momentum slows. Wealth becomes harder to accumulate. Choices narrow. Public expectations evolve. Japan was among the first nations to confront this reality at scale, but it will not be the last. Countries across Europe, East Asia, and North America face similar trajectories. The fourth lesson concerns personal strategy. Wealth preservation requires active engagement. Savings alone cannot guarantee security in an era of low interest rates, slow growth, and long-term instability. Japan's experience demonstrated that households must build skills, broaden income sources, and engage with financial markets thoughtfully. But beneath these large economic themes lies a more human lesson. Values change when certainty fades. As Japan's stagnation transformed the labor market, individuals reassessed what mattered. Career identity weakened. Personal well-being gained relevance. The definition of success shifted from status to balance, from hierarchy to autonomy. These lessons form the quiet architecture of Japan's long stagnation. They are not warnings delivered loudly. They are truths revealed slowly, through the erosion of assumptions once considered permanent. And now we step into the ending, a moment where the camera pulls back and the narrative returns to you. Because everything Japan revealed across 3 decades speaks not only to one nation's fate, but to the world unfolding around us. When I look at Japan's story, I see more than economic data. I see the collapse of a belief system, the quiet recalibration of identity, and the resilience required to rebuild meaning from uncertainty. You might think this story is distant, a reflection of a time and place far from your own. But if you look closely, you will see its patterns everywhere. Aging populations, fragile pensions, wage stagnation, rising living costs. The future Japan entered decades ago is the future many nations are walking toward right now. You should not fear this, but you cannot ignore it. Japan's longest crisis showed that wealth is not guaranteed by growth, by institutions, or by loyalty. It is built through awareness, adaptation, and the courage to question systems even when they appear unshakable. And so we arrive at the final truth this journey reveals. Wealth is not merely personal. It is structural. It is historical. It is shaped by forces larger than any one life. But it responds to those who understand it. And now, as we close this story, it becomes yours. If this opened your mind, stay curious. The next story is already unfolding beneath your feet.